Welcome to the Sri Lankan Literary Society Zoom series, and our guest today is Ameena Hussein. I won't say anything about her because Shihan is going to introduce her. I will only just welcome her and thank her very much for appearing on our show today. Now I shall hand you over to Shihan to introduce Ameena, and then after that we will start the presentation. So over to you, Shihan.
Okay, thank you, Mahendra. So Ameena Hussein is a sociologist, but she turned into a writer and publisher. And some of you may have read the books that she herself has published, and you might know of their publishing company. And she's the co-founder of that company. I first contacted Ameena actually when I was in Sri Lanka some years ago, because Professor Yasmin Gunaratna, who published a book through her publishing company, recommended that I should speak to her. So then I heard Ameena giving a talk to the Ibn Batuta Foundation a few months ago, and that's a Sri Lankan foundation. And then I got in touch with her, this time through Ameena's cousins, who are friends of ours, Faisal and Amira Hussein. So Ameena, listeners would, I think, like to know a bit more about you. So would you mind saying a few things about yourself for those who don't know you much, to get to know you before you start your lecture?
Thank you so much, Shihan, and thanks, Mahendra, for that lovely beginning so that we all know we are all on the same page. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for spending your Sunday afternoon listening to my presentation. So even though Shihan said I'm a sociologist, I haven't practiced for so long now that I don't readily describe myself as a sociologist anymore. So I was trained as a sociologist. I went to an American university and I practiced for about 10 years as a sociologist in Sri Lanka during the height of the war. And that inspired me actually to write a lot of stories, which is how I published my first two collections of short stories and started my own publishing house with my husband, Sam Pereira. So the publishing house is called Pereira Hussein because we couldn't agree on any other name. And we couldn't quite disagree on our own names being there. So that was a happy medium. I call myself a writer-publisher because that's actually what occupies my time 90% of the time. 10% of the time, I live in Puttalam on the northwest coast, and that's how this story all began, the story about Ibn Batuta. And my husband and I run a coconut and kaju farm there. So right now we haven't been able to go for about 2 months, and it's really frustrating not to be able to leave, but we are in severe lockdown here in Colombo, and I agree with the authorities because the pandemic is running away a bit with us. So that's it actually, Shihan.
Okay, thank you very much. So Mahendra, I think we should now start the lecture.
So to begin, Ibn Batuta in Sri Lanka, which is based on my book, Chasing Tall Tales and Mystics, and it is my travels in Ibn Batuta's footsteps in Sri Lanka. So what we have is Ibn Batuta is a 14th century Moroccan traveler. At the age of 21, he left on this most compelling journey where he traveled to 40 countries. He traveled 117,000 kilometers, and it's almost double of what Marco Polo traveled, but he's lesser known. Let's just compare a little bit. I like to do this comparison just to show how much more he did than Marco Polo. So you have Marco Polo traveling 24 years, Ibn Batuta travels 29 years. Marco Polo travels to 20 countries, Ibn Batuta travels to 40. Marco Polo does a measly 24,000 kilometers, Ibn Batuta 117,000. So it could be that he is less well known because his travels were not translated and available as much as Marco Polo's travels were. In 1325, on the 14th of June, 21-year-old Ibn Batuta finishes his law studies, and he decides to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, which is what every Muslim who is able and can afford to do it should do at least once in his lifetime. So when he sets out, Ibn Batuta is all alone. I'm not sure how many 21-year-olds would embark on such a trip. And then when he arrives in Mecca, traveling through Tunisia, traveling through Egypt, encountering wars, having to change his route, he stays in Mecca for 3 years. So he does pilgrimage for 3 years. And one of the things is he meets many other pilgrim travelers. He meets many other students from all parts of the world, and he's filled with a burning desire to travel. So he has many adventures, and he returned to Morocco in 1354 and settled in Fez. Now, at the request of the Sultan, he began recounting his travels to a scribe, Ibn Juzay. Now, you might ask me, how does he remember everything? There are two things that happen, two things we must keep in mind. So Ibn Batuta did write notes because he says that he lost his notes frequently. Every time he was shipwrecked, every time his goods were stolen by brigands, by thieves, they would take his notes as well. But Ibn Batuta is trained as a jurist. One of the key components of being a jurist is that you have to remember the hundreds and thousands of Sharia laws that exist. And so you have to, plus you have to know the Quran backwards and forwards. So you have a very trained memory. And each time he lost his notes, he just wrote the whole thing up again. We can also believe that because he's right about so much. He's wrong about a lot of things, but he's right about so much. So I can imagine that by the time he got back to Morocco to hang up his traveling hat, he would have a fair amount of notes, and then he would just rely on his prodigious memory. So the book that comes out of it is called, the English translation is, A Gift to Those Who Contemplate the Wonders of Cities and the Marvels of Traveling. Isn't that a fabulous title? But it is commonly referred to as Ibn Batuta's Rihla, and Rihla means travels, it means journey, because nobody can actually say the whole title in one breath. This is his voyage. It's divided into 4 parts. So we have the red part, which is number 1. Then we have the purple part. Then we have the green part. Then he comes back to Mecca. So the green part is to go to Kenya to visit Mombasa and Kilwa. Then he comes back to Mecca, and then he embarks on his long journey. So sometimes you can see that there are a few gaps. Ibn Batuta doesn't quite say where he got from point A to point B. But because maybe he lost his notes, maybe he didn't think it was important, or maybe the manuscript that we found didn't have that section, who knows? But he eventually finds his way to China because that is what he wanted. That is the end of the Muslim world. And his promise to himself was he would journey from end to end of the Muslim world. And when he discovered that there were Muslims in China, he said, I'm going to China. On the way, he has one of the longest stops he has on the way to China is in Delhi. Delhi is ruled by Sultan Tughlaq, and Sultan Tughlaq has an amazing reputation in the Middle East amongst travelers, amongst pilgrims, amongst traders, amongst religious scholars. His court was one of the most magnificent of the time. So when Ibn Battuta gets there, he, in any case, has been courting kings and sultans on the way. He arrives in Delhi like a prince. He comes with 1,000 horses, with about 12,000 robes, with courtiers, with slaves. And when Tughluq meets him, Tughluq thinks he's an important personage. So Tughluq hires him as the Qadi, which is the religious judge, to judge over all cases in Delhi. And he stays in Delhi for 9 years. But he doesn't lose sight of his eventual destination, which he wants to be China. So he asked Tughluq to send him as an ambassador to China. So Tughluq ties him with, pearl gloves and pearl coats, with gems, with spices, with slaves, and sends him off. But Ibn Batuta has to go to the south of India before he can catch the ship to China. When he's in the south, he hears that the Maldives has been recently converted to Islam, and it has been a Muslim country for the past 200 years. Naturally, being curious about all things Muslim, he decides to visit the Maldives. So, in August of, actually in 1342, right? At the end of 1342, he boards a ship that takes him to the Maldives. When he's in the Maldives, he falls in love with the place. He marries one of the ruler's sisters. He marries 3 other wives. He stays there for 9 months, but he eventually has to flee because Ibn Battuta is a bit of a meddlesome person. He meddles in politics, he meddles in religious affairs, and so what happened was he got on the bad books of the Sultan, and in August of 1344, he has to board a ship and he has to run away from the Maldives. He thought he was running away back to the south of India, where he could leisurely take his boat onwards, and that journey did include the island of Serendip, what he called Lanka. But what happened was he got caught to a huge storm, and the storm blew them completely off course, and they found themselves on the northwest coastline of the island of Sarandip. So he most probably arrived in Lanka somewhere in September, early September, and after completing his travels, which might have taken, very likely, about 2 months, he left in November of 1344 and went back to India. So how did he know that he was on the northwest coast of the island of Sarandip? He knew because they saw Adam's Peak. And Adam's Peak could be seen from far away. When you were far out at sea, it could be seen. And Adam's Peak was a marker of Sarandip. So that's how all the sailors, the traders, and the religious pilgrims knew where they were. He says, these are Ibn Battuta's own words. He says, after 9 days, we perceive the mountain of Serendip. They are rising into the heavens like a column of smoke. So in map terms, this is what you will see. He left South India, came to the Maldives, got blown off course, ended up on the northwest coast, and then went back to South India. So why was he so keen to come to the island of Serendip? So even though Lanka was famous for many things, like gems, spices, cinnamon, pearls, elephants, Ibn Battuta came for something else. He came for Adam's Peak because he wanted to climb Adam's Peak and do pilgrimage. And why did he want to do that? Adam's Peak is also called Sri Padam. It's also called Shiva Oli Padam. And that's the reason why it's important to Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. So the Buddhists believe that Adam's Peak is called Sri Padam because it holds the footprint of Lord Buddha. And the Hindus believe that it holds the footprint of Lord Shiva. And the Muslims believe it holds the footprint of the first prophet of Islam, Adam. And some Christians believe that it holds the footprint of St. Thomas. So that is why some Christians also do pilgrimage up Adam's Peak. There were many routes up Adams Peak. This is a colonial map, and as it is, it shows about 4 or 5 routes. So it shows the Ratnapura Kani route, shows the Kuruvita route, the Kitulgala route, Ginigattena, Maliboda, Maskelia, and the Alupola Haputale route as well. What route did Ibn Batuta go on? He went up a route he called Baba route, which is the father's route, a very hard route, and he came down the Mama route, which was an easier route. This is Ibn Batuta's route to Adams Peak and beyond. So the city names that you have written in blue are what is mentioned in his travels, in his travel book. What is in yellow is the route that I took to get to these places. And how I found that route is by looking at maps of old, very old roads, of colonial writings, and to discover old pilgrim paths up the peak. So Ibn Battuta landed in Putlam and he went to Moondal. His first stop was in Moondal. It's a very small town today. It was the last territory of the king of Jaffna. From Moondal, he goes to Chilau and he calls Chilau Bandar Salawat. Bandar meaning port in Persian. Salawat is the Arabized tongue trying to say Halawata. He then says that he goes to Adams Peak, and I believe he went to Adams Peak through Kurunegala, which was the capital of the Sinhala part of Lanka at that time, then through Kegol, Gampola, Ginigattena, Avisavella, Ratnapura. He went up Adams Peak, came down. Then I believe he went to Balangoda, which I will explain later on why I think so. And from there he went on the Hayes Lauderdale route, right, that is through Uruboka, Moravaka, Akoresa, right down to Devinora. In Devinora, he sees the magnificent temple to Opulwan, which was destroyed by the Portuguese. From there, he goes to Gale, then he goes to Colombo, and then he goes back to Putlam. He says goodbye to the Sultan of Jaffna, to the King of Jaffna. He says, thank you very much for allowing me to do this wonderful pilgrimage. And then he sets off back to India. So I now come to part 3, which is my journey in Ibn Battuta's footsteps. What you see here, this photograph here, is what triggered my whole project, which was I own a coconut estate in the north of Putlam on the Old Manor Road. And so we have to frequently go into Putlam for our supplies. And one day my husband comes back to the estate. I didn't accompany him on this journey. And he says, I have a surprise for you. And he shows me this street sign. And I had long been fascinated by Ibn Battuta. I used to talk about him. I read a little bit, but not in detail. When I saw this street sign, I thought, if he's remembered and commemorated like this in Putlam, I'm bound to find other areas in the country, in areas that he went to, where I can get traces of him. And it is actually this sign that triggered my going on this crazy mad adventure in search of Ibn Battuta. So my first stop was the Butler Mosque, and I recount in my book how mosques have always held some. I'm always apprehensive when I go into a mosque. It's not a space that, as a Muslim woman, I'm comfortable in going because it's a very male-dominated space. So I sent Sam first as an emissary, my emissary, to get permission. And there's a very funny story of how eventually we got the permission to enter the mosque. The mosque has a very interesting story that doesn't date to Ibn Battuta's time, but a little bit later. It dates to the 18th century. So when you enter the mosque, and I think by now they've had so many visitors who are coming there armed with my book, wanting to see these artifacts that they have got quite used to having strangers come. They showed me this cabinet, and in the cabinet you had some artifacts. And the story goes, the story is written in Sinhala on the side, and I've translated it into English in my book. So the story goes that it's on a 15th century site. The mosque is built on a 15th century site where it belonged to an old Muslim woman who gifted it and wanted a structure built. It was a very modest structure, which then was improved on year by year. And in 1720, Narendra Singha came to Putlam on one of his visits, perhaps to inspect his salt pans, perhaps to inspect the pearl fisheries. We do not know. He was so pleased with the reception that the Muslim people gave him in Putlam that he gifted to them the whisk, his royal whisk, the royal trumpet. He gifted many other royal accompaniments, but today what is left is only part of the trumpet. It is a pretty big trumpet. We have the whisk, and I think there is also a royal book stand that he had gifted to them. That's still there, and you can go and visit it when you visit the Butler Mosque. So in part 3, I'm highlighting what struck me in my travels. I'm not going to go to every single place that I went to, but I'm certainly going to talk about the unusual incidents that I came across. So Kurunegala was a huge surprise to me. I had actually never been to Kurunegala in depth. I was always on the way to Trincomalee, or I never stopped there to examine it, even though it was once the capital of the Sinhala kings. And perhaps it's because the modern city has grown so much around the ancient city that you don't have much of the ancient city left. So there is a deity in Kurunegala called Gale Bandara. And his story is so fantastic that I actually think he is the true deity of the country, because he represents all the many faiths of Sri Lanka, and he's also visited. His shrines are visited. This is one shrine of his. The story of Gale Bandara is that King Bhuvanekabahu I had a Muslim wife. That Muslim wife had one son, and that son's name was Vatimi. So he's called Vatimi Kumaraya, or Prince Vatimi. When Bhuvanekabahu died, Prince Vatimi ascended the throne. He was reputed. So I have a Muslim version and a Sinhala version of the story. So now comes the Muslim version. He was reputed to be a really good, kind king. And even though he was not a Buddhist, he spent a lot in the terms of building temples, in giving danes, in attending periods, in doing everything that a ruler should do. But the Buddhist monks were not happy. They wanted a true Sinhala Buddhist ruler on the throne. So they devised a way to get rid of him. They invited him up to Athagala. And if you go to Kurunegala, Athagala is the rock that dominates the whole city. He went in good faith, and when he went for the period, halfway through the period, they pushed him off the rock and he fell to his death. So his body was taken by the Muslims, and it was buried here. So a shrine has come up around him, and people of all three faiths, so that is Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims, come to the shrine. And while I was there, a couple of Sinhala women came and they lit camphor. The Muslim keeper recited Muslim prayers, blessed the women, and then they went away. Now, conversely, you have another story about Prince Vatimi. This is the Gale Bandara Devale. This holds the other story, because on top of this Devale, there is a rock, and that is the inset of the photograph on the left side. And that is the rock that Prince Vatimi fell onto when he died, and he died. And they have commemorated it by having a small gold statue of him. When Prince Vatimi died, he was transformed first into a demon, and then he became a Bandara Devya, which is a powerful chieftain god. When I asked the Kapurala in charge of the Devalaya, how did that transform? How does a demon become a Bandara Devyo? He said, well, Saman and Kataragama Deyo entreated him not to be a demon, but to become a Devyo, and so he did. I think there might be another side story to that, which I didn't quite get at that time. So to this shrine as well, so this is a Devale, and to this shrine as well, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists come and they ask for favors. So I would say that Gale Bandara, who is Prince Vathimi deified, and he holds he holds the heart of this country because he embodies and represents multiculturalism, which is what this whole country is all about. On right next to Athargala is another very interesting gala, and that's called Ibagala or tortoise rock. So Athargala means Tusker Rock, and Ibagala means tortoise rock. It's right by the side, and you might actually miss this rock, but it's worthwhile to go and see just for this inscription and a very interesting shrine beside the inscription, which is that King Buanekabahu's mother, so King Buanekabahu the first, his mother wanted to go up and pay obeisance at Sri Padam, but she was very old and the king knew that she would not survive the trip. So he sent his artisanal workers up to Sri Padam and told them to make a copy of the footprint. They come back, they make a copy on Ibagala, and what they do is they then cut steps all around Ibagala. When they finish, King Buanekabahu tells his mother, "Come, I'll take you on pilgrimage," and just takes her round and round Ibagala, brings her to where the copy of the footprint is, and then she dies soon after, believing that she has completed the pilgrimage at Sri Padam. I thought that was such a beautiful story of filial devotion, of consideration, of mother's wish. And here, this is the footprint. So this is the footprint that they took, which is up Sri Padam, a copy, and it's well worth the visit to come here and look at it, because actually you cannot see the original footprint up Sri Padam because it has been covered with concrete and it is so well guarded. And like Ibn Batuta said, in the 14th century, even here, people come and they throw coins and throw money, to pay their respects to a copy of the footprint of the Lord Buddha. Another interesting place I went to was this mosque. It's called the Jannat Mosque in Ratnapura. I met two marvelous trustees, Mr. Farooq and Mr. Tuan of the mosque. Mr. Farooq he held us captivated for 5 hours because he said that he used to go up Adam's Peak with the Sinhala Buddhist pilgrims, and he could recite all the gathas that they were reciting, because he said that's what he used to recite as well when he used to go up as a little boy to do a pilgrimage up to Sri Padam. So the story about the Ratnapura Mosque comes down to these graves. So the legend has it that there was a Muslim man from the south who was told, "Go up the river and you will see a tree, and right by the tree will be some important devotees who have come on pilgrimage." So he gets the boat and he comes up the river and he sees a huge banyan tree and he docks there. And when he comes out, he sees 41 graves, and they're graves of Muslim pilgrims who did the pilgrimage up Adam's Peak and who died there. Of the 41, one was a woman, and it is her name, Jannat, that the current mosque is named after. Of the 41 graves, you have 2 that are left like this. The others have been cemented over. I think they might date to like about the 18th century, but it is a shrine room that has been constructed, and we had a marvelous opportunity to go and visit the graves and pay our respects to these unknown pilgrims. And then, if you remember, I spoke about Ibn Batuta most possibly having gone to Balangoda. So this is the reason. The reason is that off Balangoda, maybe 10 kilometers away from Balangoda, is a wonderful rock encroachment that is called Kuragala in Sinhala, and which Muslims call Jailani. Why they call it Jailani is after the Iraqi Sufi saint Abdul Qadir Jailani. And every year, so they believe that he came and meditated at Kuragala. He meditated at Kuragala for 11 years, they believe, and then he disappeared. So then the next story is that he appeared then in Iraq, where he died. And so we have a ceremony that is enacted here once a year in honor of Abdul Qadir Jailani. It is a ceremony that is dying out, and I am ever so privileged that I got to see it. It's called the Rifai Ratib, and it's a ceremony of knives and swords and implements that can hurt and harm. But when these particular dervishes are in the throes of religious ecstasy, it does not hurt and harm them. And I watched it, and I can attest that I have seen a dervish cut off his tongue, and I have seen the leader heal the tongue back. And I saw the tongue the next day completely healed with just one line. I cannot explain these things, but I can say that today it's getting rarer and rarer to see these kinds of ceremonies performed. So these dervishes are called the Rifai because they practice these extreme forms of devotion. And once a year they come to Jailani or Kuragala and they have their ceremony. Then Ibn Batuta, he heads down to Gale. One of the places he mentions is Gale. And when I went to Gale, I came across, no one would have seen this shrine. So this shrine is, you have the Gale fort, and to get permission to see this shrine, you have to get to Batiri Cove. This is called Batiri Cove. The reason it's called Batiri Cove is after this saint who is buried here called Batiri. His name was Batiri. You have to get permission from the army encampment that is in Gale, and then they open a small little gate on the ramparts, and then you have to go down to the rocks and you come across this pilgrim who died. And I always think when I was standing by this shrine, I thought of Ibn Batuta, because I thought so many hundreds of pilgrims have come to do pilgrimage up Adams Peak. And then what happens is many of them lose their lives, and they are unknown, their names are not known, we don't know where they're from, and then somebody decides, to just bury them respectfully. A shrine crops up, many of them have miraculous stories surrounding them, and Ibn Batuta, by the grace of God, he escaped all his near fatal encounters and lived to tell the tale. So I end with a picture of the Putlam salt fields, because this is where Ibn Batuta also came to end his journey. And this is where my journey also ended, because then I was back at my farm. And you see people working the salt fields. And it was here that I discovered an ancient implement that is still used in our salt fields that amazingly is also used in the Moroccan salt fields. I put this photograph of the implement on my Facebook, and a Moroccan friend wrote back saying, where did you see this implement? Because it's Moroccan. And I said, no, it's not Moroccan. It's Sri Lankan. We have it here. And she said, but we use the exact same implement in our salt fields. So on that note of the world being so small, of shared knowledge, of shared faiths and shared journeys, I say thank you very much for listening.
Okay, well, what can I say? It's wonderful to listen to Ameena, and she has whetted our appetites to read more about it. And all I can say, thank you so much, Ameena, and thank you, Shehan, for inviting her. And thank you all participants for taking part and having such a lively discussion. We have gone a little bit beyond time, but I'm sure Ameena wouldn't mind that. So if you unmute all yourselves, we can actually show our appreciation by clapping our hands together. So unmute, please. That's it.
Thank
Okay.
you all so much. You all were wonderful. You all were a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night to Sri Lankans and the other
Good
people.
night.
Good night.